Welcome back to Biology 2210L, Anatomy and Physiology 1 Lab at CNM. We are this week continuing our discussion of the nervous system. So last week we looked at the spinal cord and basic neuron structure. This week we're going to focus on spinal nerves and talk a little bit about the reflex. So let's begin with spinal nerves. Spinal nerves, of course, are how the spinal cord communicates with the body. Both incoming and outgoing messages from the spinal cord will travel through structures known as spinal nerves. It would be a mistake to say that all messages pass to and from the brain through the spinal cord by way of spinal nerves. As we'll see towards the end of this semester, there are 12 pairs of so-called cranial nerves that pass directly to and from the brain, bypassing the spinal cord. But it is true that a large number of messages that reach the brain do so through the spinal cord, and messages, of course, enter and exit the spinal cord through these structures known as spinal nerves. Now, what is a nerve? A nerve is an organ. It does contain a variety of tissue types, blood vessels, connective tissue, neurons, glial cells, etc. So it's a cord-like organ. Some people mistake them for tendons or ligaments, but they're not nearly as durable or tough as tendons or ligaments. And they course throughout the body, and they consist essentially of axons, the axons of either sensory neurons or motor neurons held together by connective tissues. We can classify spinal nerves as either mixed nerves that contain both incoming or sensory information and outgoing or motor information. And all the spinal nerves are mixed nerves. There are such things as motor nerves that contain solely motor fibers and sensory nerves that contain solely sensory information, but those are, again, up in the cranial nerves. All the spinal nerves are mixed nerves that contain a mixture of incoming and outgoing messages. Now, a typical nerve has some structure to it that is reminiscent of whole skeletal muscle structure. So recall, first of all, that axons are surrounded by Schwann cells making up a myelin sheath. But then in addition to that, we have layers of connective tissue that hold the axons together inside the nerve. And this is where it becomes, again, reminiscent of skeletal muscles. So once again, the axons are not uniformly arranged throughout a nerve, but instead are packaged into bundles. And once again, these bundles are referred to as fascicles, just as we saw in skeletal muscle structure. And the connective tissues that hold everything together are named very much like the muscle connective tissues: endoneurium, perineurium, and epineurium. Again, reminiscent of endomysium, perimysium, and epimysium in the muscle. So what is endoneurium? Again, that's the deepest and loosest of these connective tissues. This is the tissue that surrounds individual axons and myelin sheaths. The perineurium is a different layer, and it wraps around whole fascicles. The perineurium actually consists of epithelial tissue as well, which is an interesting observation. That's different from perimysium. And then finally, epineurium is a dense kind of tissue, that very tough kind of tissue that wraps around the entire nerve, much like epimysium wraps around the entire muscle. And it's epineurium that then will gradually fuse and grade into deep fascia, which then holds the nerves in place within the body among groups of muscles and blood vessels and so on. Again, we do need to supply blood to the connective tissues and the axons themselves, and so not surprising to find that blood vessels will course throughout the nerve, supporting the tissues metabolically. Here we see what this all looks like. Again, the nerve emanates from the spinal cord. Recall that all spinal nerves originate as two roots, a dorsal root and a ventral root. The dorsal root can always be distinguished from the ventral root by the presence of this lump, which is the dorsal or posterior root ganglion. Recall that a ganglion is a collection of neuron cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. So the vast majority of neuron cell bodies are in the gray matter of the spinal cord or brain, but you will find neuron cell bodies out again in the peripheral nervous system, as we said last time. And so this is one of the places, this dorsal root ganglion. Also remember that the two roots have different functions. The dorsal root contains sensory neurons. The ventral or anterior root contains motor neurons. So you'll notice once the two roots fuse together, the nerve that's formed becomes a mixed nerve. Contains, as we said, messages going in and out. Also remember that the reason that the neuron cell bodies of the sensory neurons are here in the ganglion is because sensory neurons are unipolar neurons, have that unusual shape, whereas the motor neurons have their cell bodies here in the gray matter of the spinal cord. But our focus here is really what's going on out in the nerve itself, and what we see, as we just described, the axons themselves, which are these tiny little fibers here, the individual axons are clustered together into bundles called, once again, fascicles. The loose connective tissue that holds the individual fibers together within a fascicle, once again, is called endoneurium. The connective tissue and epithelium that surrounds fascicles is called perineurium. And then you have a tough, durable epineurium that surrounds the entire nerve. So that is the typical structure of a spinal nerve. And this again is just some information that I've already talked about previously. This is a close-up of the dorsal root ganglion at the base of the spinal nerve, and you can see again these represent a combination of the neuron cell bodies of the unipolar neurons, and you also have a kind of glial cell in here that helps hold everything together and support the cells called satellite cells. All right, so how are these spinal nerves arranged, and how many are there? Well, as you can see here, there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and we name the nerves based on approximately what region of the spinal cord they associate with. And of course, these regions of the spinal cord are associated with the vertebrae that surround the spinal cord. So we have these 31 pairs of spinal nerves are broken down into 8 cervical nerves, which of course exit the cervical vertebrae. The first one actually exits above the first vertebra, above the atlas, between the skull and the atlas, and then the others pass out of the spinal cord through the vertebrae, through the intervertebral foramina. These are the openings between adjacent vertebrae. In the thoracic region, we have 12 thoracic spinal nerves, then 5 lumbar spinal nerves, and again you can see they're passing out at these levels. These indicate the vertebrae through which the spinal nerves are passing. 5 sacral nerves, and then 1 coccygeal nerve out down by the tailbone. Again, this just kind of summarizes what we've been talking about, the spinal cord with its 2 roots fusing together to form a spinal nerve that then passes out of the body. In lecture, you're going to talk about some other branches that occur very close to the vertebral column. These branches are referred to as rami. In each one is a ramus, and these are most often associated with the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic nervous system. But that's a topic for lecture, not something we're going to touch on here in lab. All right, so we know that we have these different nerves coming out at different levels in the spinal cord. What often happens, not always, but what often happens is that the spinal nerves, once they exit from the vertebral column, very quickly start to anastomose. Anastomosis is a fusing and branching process where fibers, this can happen in blood vessels as well, where fibers or tubes will split and then fuse back together and split again and fuse back together. So you actually have multiple alternative pathways that blood, or in this case nerve signals, can take. So a nerve plexus is essentially a net-like pattern of nerves that forms amongst spinal nerves once they exit the spinal cord. And we actually have several different plexuses associated with our spinal nerves. We have a cervical plexus, again, of course, cervical meaning neck, that is made up of the cervical nerve C1 through C5. Those nerves will, again, fuse and branch and fuse and branch to form this cervical plexus. The cervical plexus supplies innervation to the neck, and one nerve will travel down beyond the neck to the diaphragm, the muscle that we breathe with, and we'll talk about that when we look at the cervical plexus in more detail. You'll notice it doesn't say anything about supplying the head, because the head is primarily supplied by the cranial nerves that pass out of the brain directly. The next plexus down from the cervical plexus is the brachial plexus. Of course, brachial means arm, and so not surprising to see that this supplies the arm and parts of the shoulder. The brachial plexus consists mostly of cervical nerves again, C5 through C8, and then the first thoracic nerve, only the first thoracic nerve. So the brachial plexus, like the cervical plexus, consists mostly of cervical nerves, but it's not the same cervical nerves. The next plexus is the lumbar plexus. And at this point, we've moved down to the lower back. And you might say, well, wait a minute, what happened to all the thoracic nerves in between? Isn't there a thoracic plexus? And the answer is no. Thoracic nerves do not form a plexus. Thoracic nerves tend to stay independent of one another as they travel out of the spinal cord and then arc around the torso wall, serving the torso. So we don't really see our next plexus until we get down to the lower back region, and we have the lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus, as you can see, consists of spinal nerves L1 through L4, and these, as you can see, supply the abdominal wall, some of the thigh, and some of the pubic area. Below that, we have a sacral plexus, and the sacral plexus does include some of the lumbar nerves, and then, of course, most of the sacral nerves, just not including S5. So L4, L5, the last two lumbar nerves, and then all the sacral nerves except for S5. And the sacral plexus tends to serve the floor of the pelvis and the legs. And then finally, a minor little nerve plexus called the Coccygeal plexus. That includes some of your last sacral nerves, S4 and S5, and then the first coccygeal. And that tends to just be very local around the buttocks area. Now these nerve plexuses, again, since they consist of mixed nerves, are involved in sensation and motor function. The motor function is easy to understand. They send out messages to stimulate muscle contraction. The somatosensory function, of course, is just sensing stimuli from the skin, sensitive touch, temperature, things like that. And then a lot of what we call proprioception. Proprioception is essentially how the body monitors its own condition, its own position in space. And so if you think about it, in order to maintain balance and really have any kind of coordination of muscle movement, we have to know at all times what position the body is in, so we know what to do with it, so we know how to respond. And this is very sort of fundamental and largely happens at the subconscious level. But we're always aware of our state of muscle contraction. We're always aware of what position our joints are in. And this helps us maintain balance and coordination. So for instance, one of the reasons you start to reflexively respond if you're off balance, if you are walking along and you trip, for instance, it's not just your conscious awareness that you've tripped, it's that your body is sent into a position that it didn't anticipate, into a position that your conscious mind didn't control. And so your body immediately senses that various joints and muscles are stretched or contracting or bent in such a way that's unexpected. And this creates reflexive responses to try to recover your balance. This is proprioception, this general awareness and sensation of what's going on in your body, and specifically in your joints and muscles and bones, helping you to understand body position and balance. So these are the kinds of functions that our spinal nerves are taking care of. The sensory functions that we just talked about, and of course, straightforward muscle contraction. So we're going to look at each plexus now and just talk about some of the more important nerves that come off of each plexus. And so we're going to start with the cervical plexus, the one that's up highest in the body. And again, you see the cervical plexus here up in the neck, formed again from the nerve C1 through C5. And as we said, a plexus is just a fusing, branching network of nerves that are produced by the basic spinal nerves coming out of in this case, the neck. Now, as you can see here, there are a variety of nerves and structures that come out of the cervical plexus. We're only going to pay attention to one in lab, and that's the phrenic nerve. And we're going to do this with all the plexuses. We're not going to look at every nerve that comes out of the plexus. We're just going to look at a few select ones. So for the cervical plexus, we want to know that the phrenic nerve originates here in the plexus. Here's the phrenic nerve here. This nerve is interesting because rather than staying up in the neck, it's going to travel down along the wall of the internal wall of the thoracic cavity and ultimately serve the diaphragm, which is the respiratory muscle down here, forms the floor of your thoracic cavity. So this is the nerve that we use to stimulate breathing, ventilation. And if this nerve gets damaged, you will largely stop breathing. There's some sense to having this nerve come off of the cervical plexus. What this means is that if you damage the spinal cord anywhere below this cervical plexus, you may lose motor function. You may be paralyzed in the legs or even the arms and the legs. But to lose function of the diaphragm, which is served by this phrenic nerve, you would have to sever the spinal cord somewhere above or right at the level of this cervical plexus to interfere with messages coming out the phrenic nerve. And so there's value here in reducing the likelihood that a spinal cord injury is going to cause a loss of breathing ability. And so that's why people who do suffer these unfortunate injuries often may lose the function in their legs or even arms and legs, but still be able to breathe on their own. There are some unfortunate cases where the damage to the spinal cord is so high that you also lose your respiratory function as well. The best known case of that might be, say, Christopher Reeve, who was an equestrian and during competition fell off of his horse and broke his neck very high up and lost not only his arm and leg function, but also his respiratory function. Here we see what the cervical plexus looks like in a cadaver, kind of essentially what you expect it to look like. Another view of the cervical plexus, again with a highlight on the phrenic nerve and how it comes down and passes into the thoracic cavity. All right, the next plexus we want to talk about is the brachial plexus. And again, remember the brachial plexus consists mostly of cervical nerves, but does also involve that first thoracic nerve. The brachial plexus, again, is a network, a branching, fusing network, and what pops out of it, essentially, by the time you get to the end of it, are three what we call cords. And these are shown in gray here. These are the major 3 cords that ultimately come out of the brachial plexus. And these 3 cords are referred to as the lateral cord, which is, of course, the most lateral one, the medial cord, which is, of course, the most medial, and then intermediate to those and behind them, posterior to them, is the posterior cord. And so this creates a very characteristic pattern in the shoulder where you see, again, up here, even at this small level, you can see 3 basic cords coming out. Now, each of these cords gives rise to some specific nerves that are going to, again, serve the shoulder and mostly the arm. And it's our job to be able to identify these nerves that are coming out of these cords. Well, the posterior cord, the one that's posterior, is kind of separate from the other 2. So if you follow the posterior cord down, you will see that the posterior cord essentially gives rise to 2 nerves, a smaller axillary nerve and then a larger radial nerve. So the axillary cord, the posterior cord gives rise to the axillary nerve and the radial nerve. This is not organized very well on your list of terms. The nerves are not listed under the cords to which they belong, so you may want to rearrange your notes a little bit here to make sure you understand that these 2 nerves, axillary and radial, come off only the posterior cord. Now, what about the lateral and medial cord? Well, the lateral and medial cord do have a connection with each other. As you see here, the part of the lateral cord will come medially and part of the medial cord will come laterally, and you get this V-shaped region where they fuse together. This fusion leads to a nerve known as the median nerve. So the median nerve, which then is going to, again, travel down the arm, that is really derived from 2 separate cords. Part of it comes from the lateral cord, part of it comes from the medial cord. And students often look for this V as a landmark in the arm to help orient themselves. Now, this is not the only nerve that comes off the medial and lateral cords. Each cord will also give rise to its own separate nerve. So the lateral cord not only gives rise to the median nerve through this V, but notice it also has a branch that comes off and remains separate. This is the musculocutaneous nerve. The medial cord also has a branch that comes off and remains separate, just comes from the medial cord, and this is known as the ulnar nerve. So off of the lateral and medial cords, we really have 3 nerves to pay attention to. A median nerve, which is derived from both, a musculocutaneous nerve, which comes from the lateral cord, and an ulnar nerve that comes from the medial cord. Instead of looking for a V or seeing a V, in some cases, students take it one step farther and actually look for an M. I don't know if you can visualize that here. We see an M pattern, up, down, up, down. And I like the M because the M helps me visualize all the nerves I have to remember. The center of the M is the median nerve. This outer part of the M is musculocutaneous, and this inner part of the M is the ulnar nerve. And here we see on a cadaver the brachial plexus. Specifically, we see the lateral cord here. We see the posterior cord behind it, and we see the medial cord poking out from behind this blood vessel. This is a blood vessel right here. And so medial cord, posterior cord, lateral cord. Here's the V that we talked about, where the lateral and medial come together. And if you're looking carefully, you might see the M, up, down, up, down. There's our M that we were just talking about. Now, some students ask, well, gee, how can I tell nerves from blood vessels? Well, remember, blood vessels are hollow. Excuse me, nerves are solid. So if you really were looking at a cadaver and had access to it, you could squeeze on this vessel. This is an artery, and you would feel that it's hollow inside. And so that's a good way to tell the difference between an artery and a nerve. Now, what do we want you to know functionally about the nerves of the brachial plexus? Well, we do As we did with the phrenic nerve, we said it served the diaphragm. We'd like you to know what muscles each nerve serves. And I know this sounds terrible, but as is usual, I recommend that you not try to memorize things, but that you just try to focus on pattern. Now, in some cases, there's a couple of things you'll have to memorize, but in most cases, if you can just remember a pattern, that will help you answer any questions about function. And so we're just going to run through all the nerves of the brachial plexus fairly quickly. We start with the axillary nerve. Remember, the axillary nerve comes off the posterior cord, and the axillary nerve serves just a few muscles. The axillary nerve, and this one is unfortunately one you just have to memorize, serves the deltoid and the teres minor muscles. Deltoid and teres minor. And the assumption here is that you know these muscles because we just spent some weeks learning them. Remember, there's always sensory function to all these nerves as well, but that's skin sensation and proprioception and so on. So we're not going to be too specific about that. All right, so the axillary nerve, you just want to associate with these two muscles. The radial nerve is the other nerve that comes off of the posterior cord. And if we take a look at the radial nerve, what do we see as I focus? Again, the teres minor and the deltoid are served by the axillary nerve. So we're focusing now on the radial nerve. And very quickly I see triceps, the three heads of the triceps muscle, brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, supinator, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digitorum. And there are some other muscles there that we didn't learn. I just listed the ones that we learned. What's the pattern here? Well, these are all the muscles that are found on the posterior arm. And so instead of trying to remember a list of muscles for this nerve, I think the best thing to do is just try to remember that the radial nerve serves the back of the arm, the posterior muscles of the arm. And then if you remember your muscle locations, you'll be able to deduce which muscles that would be. All right, so radial nerve serves the posterior muscles of the upper and lower arm. The median nerve, remember, is the nerve that's formed by the V, by the fusion of portions of the lateral and medial cord. If I follow the median nerve down, what I notice is it doesn't serve any muscles of the upper arm. It doesn't actually start sending off innervating fibers until we get to the forearm. And if I look at some of the specific muscles that are listed for the median nerve, I see pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor digitorum superficialis, and flexor digitorum profundus, at least part of flexor digitorum profundus. Again, other muscles for sure, but these are the ones we learned. And what do I notice about those muscles? These are the muscles we learned of the anterior forearm. So again, instead of memorizing a list of muscles, I simply suggest that you try to remember that the median nerve serves the muscles of the anterior forearm, and then you'll be able to figure out which muscles those would be. Okay, remember the medial cord also gives rise to an ulnar nerve in addition to the median nerve. What does this ulnar nerve serve? It comes down and it serves the one anterior muscle that we didn't talk about, which is the flexor carpi ulnaris. Let's see, how can I remember that exception? The one muscle that the median nerve doesn't serve, flexor carpi ulnaris, served by the ulnar nerve. So hopefully you can try to find a way to remember that in your brain, that the one forearm muscle that's not served, anterior forearm muscle that's not served by the median nerve, is the flexor carpi ulnaris, and instead it's served by the ulnar nerve. Now there is a little bit of detail. I remember in the last slide we saw that the median nerve served part of the flexor digitorum profundus. Well, the ulnar nerve does serve another part of the flexor digitorum profundus. So that's one that you may have to make a mental note of and try to memorize, is that the flexor digitorum profundus muscle has two different nerves that serve it. Part of it served by the median nerve, part served by the ulnar nerve. And then finally, for the brachial plexus, we have a musculocutaneous nerve that that again comes off of the lateral cord, making this portion of the M. And very quickly what we see is the musculocutaneous nerve serves, again in terms of the muscles we learned, the biceps brachii and the brachialis. So essentially what we're talking about for the musculocutaneous are the anterior muscles of the upper arm, the brachium. Okay, so again, not too much to remember, just again look regions and patterns and then try to deduce specific innervations from there. Our next plexus is known as the lumbar plexus. Of course, again, the lumbar plexus is composed mostly or solely of lumbar nerves coming out of the lumbar region of the vertebral column. Again, forming a fairly complex plexus. Now, what nerves come out of this lumbar plexus? There's a variety. We used to ask you to learn a couple, the obturator nerve and the femoral nerve, but we've reduced that down and we're just really asking you to learn the femoral nerve at this point. So the femoral nerve, again, if you look at the lumbar plexus, the femoral nerve is essentially the longest nerve that comes out of this plexus, and it travels down to the leg and it comes out anteriorly. So it's passing out again at the spinal cord in the lumbar region, and then passes along the front of the iliac crest or the front of the ilium, and then pops out of the body wall anteriorly and basically comes down the front of the leg. The front of the leg. Okay, this is going to be important to help us distinguish the nerves that come out of the sacral plexus later, which tend to be more posterior. So here again is a view of the lumbar plexus, again in a cadaver, and notice the femoral nerve, the biggest one of these nerves, is going to pass through the body wall anteriorly near the front of the pelvic cavity, and it's going to eventually pop out here after it gets through the groin, and it's going to be an anterior nerve on the front of the leg. What do we want you to know for the femoral nerve? Well, again, in the old days, we used to also ask you to learn the obturator nerve. That's why it's on this particular diagram. And it doesn't hurt for you to see that there is such a thing as an obturator nerve. I like it because it gives us some context for that obturator foramen in the hip bones, that big opening that people wondered, why is that there? Well, again, as I mentioned in class a few weeks ago, that's mostly covered with a membrane. And so it's largely for weight reduction, but there are some things that can poke through that membrane, some blood vessels and nerves, and the obturator nerve, of course, is one thing that pokes through there. The obturator nerve is an important nerve, even though it's not on our list, and you'll notice what it does is it tends to serve those adductors of the legs, including the gracilis. So the obturator nerve is going to innervate the inside of your thigh. So I'm just telling that to you, FYI, basically. It's not on our list of terms, and so I'm not going to hold you responsible for that. What you are responsible for, though, is the femoral nerve, this large nerve that comes down the front of the hip bone and then down the front of the leg. So what muscles do we have associated with the femoral nerve? Let's take a look at them. Psoas major, iliacus, sartorius, rectus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, vastus intermedius. So where are all these muscles? These are muscles of the anterior upper leg. So the two anterior hip flexors, and then the muscles that you find on the front of the leg. So the inside of the leg, the medial leg, is served by the obturator nerve, but the front of the upper leg is served by the femoral nerve. The femoral nerve. Okay, so again, you don't want to memorize things necessarily. Just remember that the anterior hip and thigh is served by the femoral nerve. Then the last plexus that we're going to talk about is the sacral plexus. We pretty much are not going to talk too much about it, the coccygeal plexus. The sacral plexus comes out, as you can see, very low down in the vertebral column, consisting of just, again, the last couple of lumbar nerves and then most of the sacral nerves up to S4. And so, not surprisingly, this plexus is found down at the level of the sacrum, And essentially the plexus sits just in front of each side of the sacrum. Notice the nerves of the sacral plexus don't tend to come forward and come down the front of the hip and leg. They tend to stay posteriorly. They tend to stay posterior and come down the back, exit out the back of the pelvis and down the back of the leg. And there are, once again, several nerves that are emanating from this sacral plexus. And once again, we used to ask you to learn more. We used to ask you to learn the two gluteal nerves, and then the main one, the biggest nerve in the body, which is the sciatic nerve, which is the one that travels down the leg. Excuse me. Here we see a picture again on a cadaver of the sacral plexus, and again you see how very far down this plexus is located. Now, in terms of the, again, the sacral plexus, remember we had gluteal nerves, which we're not doing anymore, but once again, just FYI, just to complete the picture, notice that the gluteal nerves, not surprisingly, serve some of these muscles that either extend the hip or abduct the hip. And what we're talking about are the glutes, right? So gluteus minimus, gluteus medius, gluteus maximus. Plus, remember tensor fascia latae, which causes abduction at the hip. So those gluteal nerves do serve those muscles. Those muscles are not supplied by the sciatic nerve, instead by the gluteal nerves. But what does this largest nerve of the body, the sciatic nerve, do? Well, remember the femoral nerve travels down the front of the leg, and this is a typo here. This should read the sciatic and tibial nerves, not the femoral and tibial nerves. So I apologize for that. Let's go ahead and cross that out right now, just to make sure we're all clear. It's not the femoral nerve. This is the sacral nerve. Sorry, my handwriting isn't so great using this tool. And of course, it's not the sacral nerve. So I've made two mistakes. It is the sciatic nerve coming off the sacral plexus. All right, so now that's what we want to remember it as. By the way, these diagrams of the nerves are not in the original PowerPoint that I provided you. This is a modified PowerPoint, but you can find these images, these kinds of images that list the muscles for each nerve in a folder in CNM Learn. And the folder is entitled something along the lines of Spinal Nerve and Cranial Nerve Handout. So you do have access to these pictures other than here on the PowerPoint. Okay, so back to the sciatic nerve, again, the largest nerve in the body. It's going to come out, poke out of the body cavity posteriorly and peek out under the glutes, and it's going to travel down the back of the leg. Technically, the sciatic nerve serves the semitendinosus, the biceps femoris, adductor magnus, semimembranosus. So these are muscles that are located where? These are all the muscles that are primarily on the posterior of the upper leg, the back of your upper leg. So those are the muscles we want to associate with the sciatic nerve. Now you may be asking, well, what about the muscles of the lower leg? We didn't see anything about the lower leg yet. The femoral nerve didn't go down to the lower leg, and it looks like the sciatic does. Well, the lower leg, the entire lower leg, both anterior, posterior, lateral, all of it is served by branches of the sciatic nerve. So once we get behind the knee, the sciatic nerve splits, and technically at this point it's not called the sciatic nerve anymore. At this point of branching, it branches into two nerves, the tibial nerve and the common fibular nerve. The tibial nerve and the common fibular nerve. The tibial nerve is going to stay posterior. And so the tibial nerve, even though it's part of the sciatic nerve, obviously, technically, we don't say the sciatic nerve serves this because it's now called the tibial nerve. And it basically serves your calf, the back of your lower leg. And so what muscles do we see here? Gastrocnemius, soleus, and then some other muscles we didn't learn, tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum, longus, and so on. So when you think tibial nerve, think calf muscles. What about the common fibular nerve? Well, the common fibular nerve is going to wrap around to the side and front of the leg and serve the muscles in that region. And so here we see the common fibular nerve or peroneal nerve popping out from behind the knee, and it then itself breaks into two branches, what we call the superficial and deep fibular or peroneal nerve, but we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to simply say the common fibular nerve is going to travel down the outside of the lower leg and serve the fibularis or peroneus muscles, fibularis longus, fibularis brevis. And another branch of it's going to come down the front of the leg and serve the muscles we learned on the front of the leg, which are tibialis anterior and extensor digitorum longus. So at that point, we pretty much have all of the muscles that we learned, or most of the muscles of the arms and legs, the appendages, served by the nerves coming out of these various plexuses. The final topic for today is the reflex, and we're just going to talk very briefly about spinal reflexes. So first of all, what is a reflex? As you can see here, a reflex is a quick, involuntary, sometimes subconscious reaction to a stimulus. Reflexes basically take care of responses that we don't want to have to think about. Our brain has enough to think about at the conscious level, and certain reactions can be predictable and stereotypical enough that we can just hardwire them into the nervous system and don't require much in the way of conscious thought. So you do have to have some stimulus that initiates a reflex. The best reflexes are quick, rapid. So if you touch a hot pot, before obviously consciously you'll become aware of that. But even before you're consciously aware of that, the reflex already starts withdrawing the arm or the fingers from the hot pot. That's the value of them being quick to prevent damage. They, again, are involuntary, things that we don't want to have to spend brain power thinking about. And again, very stereotypical. You don't have much variation in a reflex. It simply is a hardwired response, hopefully a beneficial protective response to a particular stimulus. Now, the response can be either a muscle contraction, which is what we usually think of when we think of a reflex, but it also can be a glandular secretion. Remember, the effectors or the organs that nerves can stimulate out in the body can be either glands or muscles. So sometimes we have reflexive glandular responses. I think sweating is probably a good example of that. Salivation is another good example of a glandular reflex. When we're talking about a reflex involving skeletal muscles, that's often specifically referred to as a somatic reflex. Now, a typical reflex has 5 basic components to it. Now, not all reflexes have these 5. Some only have 4, but the majority of basic reflexes have 5 components. Again, it all starts with a stimulus there. You have to initiate a reflex with a stimulus, so you must have a receptor somewhere in the body that picks up the stimulus. And this can be, again, in the skin, it can be in the muscles themselves, it can be in tendons in the case of proprioception, but there has to be a receptor somewhere. Once that receptor with its specific modality of response, that receptor senses its particular stimulus, it then communicates via a synapse or synapses with an afferent neuron, a sensory neuron. And those sensory neurons then are going to carry the information from the receptors out in the body in through nerves, spinal nerves, to the spinal cord. Once the message is carried into the spinal cord by a sensory neuron, there are usually interneurons inside the spinal cord that are going to decide how to then route that message to the appropriate destination. So this is referred to as the integration center. And this, again, if you think about it, is really what we described as the job of interneurons or association neurons. They make connections within the central nervous system, deciding the appropriate place to send nerve impulses. This is the part that's missing in some reflexes. In some very simple reflexes, we don't have an interneuron, an integration center. We skip right from the sensory neuron to the next element in the reflex. But again, in most reflexes, we have an interneuron that's going to decide where to send or funnel that particular incoming signal. In a typical somatic reflex, again, the goal is to get a muscle to contract in response to the stimulus. So the interneuron should direct or route the signal then to an efferent or motor neuron, which is, as we know, going to carry a nerve impulse back out to the body. In the case of a somatic reflex, which involves muscles, we're specifically sending the message out to a muscle. And then the final element of a reflex is the effector. The effector, again, can either be a gland or a muscle. It's the thing that's going to get stimulated by the motor neuron. But again, in the case of a somatic reflex, that's going to be a muscle. And that's going to carry out the appropriate response. So I touch a hot pot, all of these elements get recruited very quickly, and in less than a second, in a fraction of a second, I contract muscles to pull the finger away from the heat. Here we see a diagram of these typical elements of a reflex arc. In this particular case, we're doing a knee-jerk reflex, and so we have a stimulus where we hit the patellar ligament with a reflex hammer. That stretches the ligament, which pulls on the muscle. We have stretch receptors inside our muscles that sense that stretch. And so those sensory receptors, which are usually located near the tendon, are then going to, so that's element number one, they're going to pick up that stretch and they're going to transmit the impulse or the signal to the second element in the reflex, which is the sensory neuron. Sensory neuron, which again is a unipolar neuron. So remember, the bodies are here in the dorsal root ganglion. But the message is going to continue on into the spinal cord, where usually we have a synapse with an interneuron. And the interneuron then is going to make a connection ultimately to a motor neuron, shown in green here. And the motor neuron, again, is going to send the signal. This is the fourth element, back to the muscle where it will stimulate contraction, and then the effector is the muscle itself, which contraction causes extension at the knee, and we get the characteristic lift of the foot. All right, so here we see a typical reflex arc. Now, if you've been following closely, you may notice that this is not a typical reflex because it is missing the interneuron. In this particular reflex, the knee-jerk reflex, this is one of the reflexes that, one of the relatively rare reflexes that does not involve an interneuron. So in this case, the sensory neuron synapses directly to the motor neuron, and the signal just does a U-turn basically and goes right back out to the muscle to cause the response. But again, in most reflexes, in between these two neurons, you're going to have an interneuron deciding how to funnel or route the message to an appropriate destination. All right, so what we just described is the so-called stretch reflex. You may wonder why our muscles do this. Why do our muscles jerk like this in response to stretching? Well, this again is a part of proprioception, and it's important in stabilizing joints. If a joint becomes unexpectedly tensed or stretched, that usually means you're starting to lose balance. You may be tipping forward, or you may be tipping sideways, and you'll need to adjust to maintain balance. It doesn't just happen in the quadriceps muscle of the leg, it happens in many muscles. And so you may notice it happens also in your head. This is a nice example, right? As you get tired, your head might start to fall forward due to gravity. That's going to stretch muscles in the back of your neck. And once you sense that stretch, you're going to have a reflexive jerking of the head back up as those muscles contract to keep the head upright. So a stretch reflex, the knee-jerk reflex, is just one example of several different kinds of stretch reflexes that we have in the body. And again, notice the knee-jerk reflex specifically is a so-called monosynaptic reflex, meaning that we have a synapse directly between the sensory and the motor neuron. There is no interneuron, as would be typical for most. Reflexes are valuable because testing those reflexes can help diagnose certain problems. The absence of a reflex may indicate some neural disease, or hypersensitivity of a reflex can also indicate some things. So, for instance, a hyper response on the knee-jerk reflex can indicate irritation, nerve irritation of the femoral nerve. One last thing to mention is that during these reflex, the reflex also involves reciprocal inhibition. Reciprocal inhibition means that as part of the reflex, we don't just stimulate a muscle to contract, we often inhibit the antagonist muscle. So this allows a very quick, jerky response of the target muscle. Remember, antagonists tend to smooth out and slow down what the agonist is doing. So by inhibiting the antagonist, we can create a more rapid, more jerky motion, which is often what's needed to protect the body in these reflexes. All right, that is it for this week. I am going to make a second video, and it'll be a very short one where I show you really our one decent model of the nervous system, and I'll just very quickly point out where all these nerves are on that nervous system plaque. So that'll be a very short 5-minute video, and I want you to take a look at that, because that's the kind of thing that will show up on a practical exam. Okay, that's it for this week. Until next week, take care of yourselves, and we will see you next time when we talk about the brain.